This is such an honor to be here, and I thought about how I was going to do this, and some of my students who are scattered around here recall Aho's random slides and general musings, and I'm not going to do that tonight, in part because one occasion where and Ruth Miller here was reminding me when I gave a talk, and Andrew Forge, a great hero of mine, was in the audience. I spilled my slide tray just before the talk. So talk about random. But at least these are organized, as are my thoughts, okay? And so life, like painting, you have lots of choices. So I decided to make some choices. And over the next 40 minutes or so, I'll talk about some of the things important to me. The outdoors and the imagination, drifting, guidance, peanut butter and jelly sandwiches, holes in the ice, space and separateness, and the sublime and the beautiful. As Leanne has brought to our attention, I live in Vermont, in a village at the edge of the woods. And right out my door, I have access to forests, mountains, rivers, rapids, waterfalls, snow and ice, all sorts of weathers. If you need to, think of it like a giant Costco of sublimity, right? Like more than you ever thought you would ever need in greater abundance than you ever thought possible. All of these things overwhelm me, even shock me into paying attention. They're the subjects of my paintings. They're insistent, and they can't be ignored. My paintings in general begin with something I've noticed or experienced, however fleetingly, often in a blink. And I'm rarely motivated by anything grand. Instead, it's like a shadow crossing a tree or noticing an earthen color in the underside of a cloud. But once in a while, a fleeting moment sticks and it becomes indelible. A minor detail anchoring an exchange between loose looking and close reading of an enormous, shocking space. Like floating in the middle of a lake on a rainy and unusually cool August morning. They're treading water, staring at the pockets of shadow along the lake edge, socked in the fog. Not just alone, but alone in the middle of a lake, in the middle of the forest. Now, let me tell you a little bit more about what I'm trying to get at. When I stand in a field, hike a mountain, or swim in a lake, I'm shocked by the space. It's a powerful feeling, and I'm sure we've all felt it to some degree. I'm compelled to register it, this momentary shock, and try to figure it out in painting. And it's always great when my dear old friends who've dealt with similar things can join me. Like Fred Church, Winslow. Winslow brought this uninvited guest, though I don't know who that is. Joan, Bill, and Agnes. And there have always been international visitors too. And lately, the Finns came by. And that means a lot since I'm Finnish-American. This is Ellen Teslev, and I just want you to take a look at the date here, 1891. Edvard Munch over there in Norway doesn't scream for another 2 years, and this is Ellen's Echo. And there's the marvelous Fanny Cherbourg, who deserves a talk of her own, and she's really special to me. And I'm just including a few images here because I can't resist. And I don't know what was happening for her in the winter of 1880, but she's starting to sling the paint around in some crazy way. There's the Canadian Tom Thompson and Fairfield, who he shows up when he can, but his social calendar is crazy. So I'm always happy to see him. And all right, so let me step back for a minute. I didn't set out to paint the landscape. And when I first moved to Vermont and began painting, I was obsessed with the figure. My paintings then were about people doing stuff. Now, they're absent of figures, but my impulse to include the figure hasn't gone anywhere. It's kind of like it's been subsumed into the painting, subsumed into the landscape. And I want to tell you what I mean by that. In 1986, I quit my undergraduate program in Boston, and I arrived in London for a course in printmaking. And I was already under Leon Kossoff's spell and Auerbach's, and through Auerbach, Constable, and Freud's, but especially Kitai's. Magicians, all of them. Or maybe it's just that I was really suggestible, and I think I still am. And now that I think about it, and this talk has helped me think about it even more, I think maybe it's a good thing for a painter to be open to being led, at least by the forces that speak to you. Still, you have to be in charge, but loosely, kind of like when you're on a boat, drifting, but you know you're going somewhere. And I want you to keep that image of a purposeful drifting in mind, because I'll get back to it in a minute. Kitai's 1976 exhibition, The Human Clay, drew its title from Auden's often quoted line, "Art's subject is the human clay." And that exhibition argued the importance of figuration as it defined the School of London. I hope Graham can share some more details with us. It was still very much on people's minds 10 years later when I got there, and it was so relevant. But by 1986, there were new challenges to Kitai's project, namely Damien Hirst and his dots and his exhibition Frieze, which included Sarah Lucas and Tracy Emin, among others. And it contested the painterly, figurative impulses of Kitai's lineup. But even 10 years removed, and with all that new exciting work that was going on, Kitai's project still had an enormous impact on me. He insisted, there's still much to be done, which really stands in contrast to the painting is dead echo that was starting to sound then. And as an ambitious young artist, I was really receptive to that. I mean, it fell on receptive ears. And Kitai's been a departure point who I've returned to again and again. And in a sense, a conversation was started. So I get back to the States, loaded with fresh ideas and stacks of drawings from a wonderful year dedicated to daily work from the figure, and an annoying quasi-English accent, a kind of incidental souvenir that I had to put my family and friends through. And so I re-enroll and finish my BFA in printmaking, making big woodcuts and large-scale monotypes. This is about 12 joined pieces of paper, large 30 by 40 inch sheets of paper. The whole thing measures 8 by 10 feet. The English accent disappeared, thankfully, and I half-heartedly, I think that's the best way to say it, half-heartedly started graduate school, only to leave that program for a job at the Putney School, teaching painting to high school kids. And that's something, by the way, I hadn't even tried to do yet, the teaching or the painting. Remember, I'd been a printmaker. So the teaching, right, I knew that would be difficult, right? Teaching's hard. But the painting, I thought, well, how hard can that be? How hard can that be? And fortunately, at the Putney School, which is steeped in, and Svetlana knows something about this, and others here too, is steeped in John Dewey's philosophy of experiential learning, right? Learn by doing is the mantra. And like, thank God there was a plan. So, I mean, I was 22, all right? I would not have hired myself. So, as I said, the job's in Vermont, one of those places on the planet where the truth of nature insists on your attention. You can't escape the landscape. It's right there. It's big, and it's not just beautiful, it's loud, and it's in your face. It's sublime, it's terrifying, and overwhelming, and literally awesome. And so, never having painted before, I set out to paint. Just that there was no way on earth I was going to paint a landscape. Like a giant cliche, no way. And facing the landscape anyways was unsettling. Not the idea that I might be a landscape painter if I do this, and not even the beauty of it, though that also made me shudder. But it was the big space. It was the big, enormous space. I just didn't know what to do. I was intimidated, and I was terrified. And I was 22. So I went as far from the big, beautiful, sweeping views as I could down the hill, and down the hill, and down the hill, until a suitable, rangy pucker bush presented itself. And I painted that pucker bush every day. I painted every day. And it felt like I didn't have a choice in the matter. And I really didn't, because my students, I arrived in July, and my students would be showing up in September. I had to get something under my belt. So I just had a few weeks. The paintings, good ones, a few good ones, and lots of really bad ones accumulated. It's like the bad ones accumulated really fast. And in that first year. And then I showed them, I remember showing them without editing, like good or bad. It kind of didn't matter. And I showed them wherever and whenever I could. Like at the Finnish American Festival with the exceptional graphic design poster treatment over here on the right. The next year, I went even deeper. I went deep into a ravine. And now as I look at it, it was really the beginning of trying to find a way to describe spaces, these spaces in the landscape. And then slowly, over the next 20 years, I made my way up the hill. And I hadn't put words to it yet, but at some point it occurred to me that I was imagining and treating the landscape as a sort of human clay. One formed and shaped each time new, each time different, in an effort to stick, to fuse, to join, and to become part of something larger. To see nature not as an outside, but as a reflection of the self, of humanity. Maybe, if I was lucky, even as a self-portrait. I've always been inclined to show forms and spaces in my work, but I've also wanted to show the paint. You know, I'm an unabashed materialist. My daughter calls me material girl. Somehow, maybe like Poussin, or better yet, Constable, I discovered I was sensitive to the spaces of the landscape, its moods, its tones, its temperatures, and its textures. Being in it, looking at it day in and day out, made me sensitive for sure. But as I grew more familiar with the landscape, an awareness of the physical and psychological disconnect, that other tension fundamental to being human, a sense of separateness started to creep in like a fissure. And there I was, a person, a free range, mostly organic, natural thing inside another natural thing, the landscape. Not separate from it, but feeling separate from it. Staring at it and being jolted by it and glued in place by the paint. And as I struggled with that tension, the woods, the rivers, and the mountains slowly became the main subjects of my painting. I mean, how could they not? And slowly, the figures disappeared. And it's like my impulse to include them was overwhelmed by other forces. And I guess that's what I mean when I said subsumed into the landscape. It's a dilemma I think about from time to time, but I don't dwell on it. That wouldn't be any fun, and this has to be fun. I just put it away and get to work. And work solves almost everything. My paintings aren't conceptual, nothing particularly clever or ironic. They're responses, tactile responses through the magic adhesive of oil paint. They're records of me standing out there, physically and sensitively, in the world. De Kooning conjures Rubens with his famous "Flesh is the reason oil paint was invented." I think we've all heard this. Both were clearly invested in the flesh-like properties of the medium. But it's Isaiah's poetry from the Old Testament that says it best for me. It circles the corporeality back to the natural world. It's like it says grass or the landscape or nature is the reason oil paint was invented. And that rings true to me. Everything, it seems, has a skin, a coating, a veneer, something to peel back, to look into, to get through. Isn't a skin, though, also something that projects outward? That part of something that presents itself to the world? The surface? It's how we attach to the painting. And I want my paintings to look like the way the ecstatic buzz that exists between my body and the world feels, and to make that feeling stick. And I believe oil paint can do that. I'm after an equivalent sensation to a person being in the woods, being in the world and transforming it, giving weight to the space and the stuff that's going on between them. And that depends on the me that's there that day and the mountain that's there that day too. The space between me and the stand of trees on the other side of the field is a synapse. Think of it as an energizing cleft unifying two elements, two separate elements, the landscape and me. Physical and alive, this synapse even transmits a pulse that to me registers as a shock, electrifying the space between. Identifying that space between is the first act of transforming it into something else. And because it's invisible, maybe I can't help but register it as familiar and imbue it with human-like physical qualities. Seeing humanizes the landscape. People looking closely humanize everything. And it's in the looking and in that synapse where I get lost. Through a close reading of it, I feel I've become part of the landscape. I inhabit it, at least in my imagination, spellbound by its beauty and glued in place by the paint. So, look, I am far from the first painter to ever think about things like this. It's just the conversation I've joined. And Clifford Still and Charles Birchfield, up here in conversation, individually had an acute awareness of the synapse, that shock of space I'm talking about. Still registered the enormity of the space like a curtain drawn forcibly across the natural world. Birchfield's wilderness, famously incorporating all the senses, was an interior one. His curtain is pulled back. To my knowledge, they neither met nor exhibited, even as their careers overlapped for almost 40 years. Still and Birchfield, both, register the synapse of space at differing frequencies. Birchfield is restless. Still's canvases. Has there ever been a more aptronymic artist? Still? Still. They're just that. They're still. Even distilled. But they're ruthless. They're ruthless in their insistence. They're less invitations than they are impositions. On a painting trip in 1993, at the edge of the White Sea in Western Russia, something close to Shama's idea up here on the screen began to take root. I had been tracing what was once the no man's land between Finland and the former Soviet Union. And one afternoon, while I was painting on the outskirts of a small village, a cyclist stopped to comment on my painting. Passersby are very generous with their comments. And gesturing to the field I was looking at, he editorialized in perfect Midwestern American dialect. It was surprising. It turns out he had been an interpreter for the Red Army, intercepting American communications during World War II. And he told me that the site of that field was the site of one of Stalin's purges, and only the thistles have grown there since. And he pedaled off. And he left me there, with that. And so I returned to my painting, but the field with the blackened thistles, some 5 feet high and like thick as an arm, had changed. Something had changed. My attention was now alerted to both what the field was and what it is. And that encounter, so beware of passersby, right? That encounter forever changed the way I look at the landscape, any landscape, like this one, which is part of a larger project retracing my father's World War II battle itinerary across France and Germany. This, a battlefield in eastern France in the Champagne region, where terrible things happened amidst extraordinary beauty, as you can imagine, the French countryside under those circumstances, and today remain hidden just barely under the surface. Which gets me to another question, one I think about a lot and one I struggle with: beauty. So what about beauty? Do we even dare talk about it? Is it okay to talk about it at the studio school? I think if there's any place to talk about it, it's here. Does it even matter? How can we say it doesn't? I think the question of beauty in the landscape, in nature, is a critical one. But how do we talk about it? What do we say when we confront or are confronted by a sunset, the ocean, a vast view from a mountain peak, cliches, all those Instagrammable moments? Beautiful. We say, of course, beautiful, but we rarely leave it at that. Absolutely unbelievable, awesome, incredible, totally unreal, dude. I have an 11-year-old. Heavenly, right? And I get it. I really get it. I get these questions are as old as the hills, especially considering the many writers and thinkers who over the centuries have pondered far deeper than I, the sublime and natural beauty. But it's all the more interesting to me today because nature is still so puzzling and because we still don't understand. I mean, we might even be more afraid of nature and beauty now. And maybe that's why we turn our backs. We've been conditioned to see it as a resource. And once we're done with it, we bury it. And once we bury it, we no longer have to face our strong, often conflicting feelings. The more rugged and remote the scene, the more abstract the reaction seems to be. And that interests me. It interests me a lot. But is it about beauty? Like standing in front of certain paintings, I love that when reality inspires awe, we reach for descriptions of the unreal, or we're left speechless. And it's difficult to imagine it any other way. Beauty is all around us, always, and reminders are everywhere in nearly everything. And sometimes I feel like my art school hero, R.B. Kitaj, when I argue in defense of beauty, or when I even dare talk about it. And while we may not have adequate language or tools to describe beauty without reference to the unreal, beauty nonetheless remains. It's undeniable. And even though I grew up in rural New Hampshire, I never once thought of it as beautiful. The small post-war neighborhood was bordered on one side by an asbestos dump and on the other side by giant power lines. These were clearly things to avoid. The trail running underneath the electrical lines, however, the ones we rode our bikes on, that was said to go all the way to Canada. And as a kid, I learned that my drawings of dogs, hawks, locomotives, trees could affect a conversation in the room. I recall sometime around age 12, pushing a drawing of a Great Dane I had just made between my parents to ease a terrible argument. And I lived in fear of those arguments, and I made lots and lots of drawings. And I presented them like a parlor trick. I made them. It was like a parlor trick, and it worked. Drawing was a tool to change my circumstances. Drawing was an escape from a real I wished wasn't, as much as it was a connection with a fantasy I believed was real. It was a between. And while I'm no longer diffusing arguments with my work, so far as I know, I'm still very much aware of that between. And that between, partially, is what my paintings are actually about, or what my painting is actually about, the synapse and the shock that permeates the space between. I think of my forest paintings not so much as paintings of the world, its places, as they are explorations of places and their worlds. The painting has become a place, encountered as we might any element of nature, and to me, they're the same. And when you spend a lot of time out in the woods, it's a good idea to have a map or a guide. And I recommend one that's current and updated. So, and recently, after returning from hiking Mount Katahdin with my friend Charlie, who, by the way, is one of those matter-of-fact, save your life in a crisis sort of people, he's an EMT. So when you go hiking in the wilderness, I'd recommend taking an EMT with you. And probably in contrast to his preparedness, I imagined a painting it's by itself as a wilderness guide, not to help you get out of the woods, but to keep you in them, to keep you lost and in between worlds. So not long after returning from the hike, I painted the dark spruce trees and path Charlie and I followed right onto the cover of an outdated 70s era guidebook from my childhood bookshelf. The internet had made it obsolete, and it's about the size of a small canvas. And as an object, it was just begging to be painted over. And that intervention changed the guidebook. You don't open it. The painting now is the guide. And then there comes a time, perhaps in everyone's life, when you need some help. There's voices out there, lots of distractions. And just because we have to do this alone doesn't mean we don't need some guidance and help along the way. Guides are rare and special, and I look for them. I always have. And don't be afraid to ask for help. Recently, I went to my friend Winslow for some help. He was happy to oblige. Homer's Adirondack watercolors are some of the finest expressions of the wilderness we have. And what's astonishing is that by the second half of the 19th century, when Homer's painting these watercolors, much of the wilderness had already been laid to waste, clear-cut, and was overrun by tourism. His watercolors, then, were reconstructed fantasies of places that no longer existed. But instead of getting sentimental, he homes in on the loss and disruption. His bearded anglers agitate the space between the then and the now, the synapse, with a line firing across an aqueous wilderness. A line so sharp that he sometimes needed a razor blade to scratch it on the sheet, whipping the white fly line through time and space, and the viewer latches onto it. It's a lifeline. It's hurling us into the past just as it tethers us to the present. You can't help but feel the separation, the synapse between. And I think they're brilliant, just brilliant. And speaking of brilliant and guides, my wife Rachel is a photographer, and she fly fishes. She's an angler. She learned it from her father, and she's teaching our kids. And it makes her feel good, and it connects her to beautiful places. We began our relationship with outings to ponds and rivers in Vermont and the Catskills. She'd fish, and I'd paint. We shared two different activities that bound us to the same landscape, and eventually to each other. Watching her cast, it occurs to me that the angler's line works like an element of drawing. She draws her line tight. It draws through her fingers. It draws through the water. There's a flash of a moment when the pristine forms of the riverscape are interrupted by this human activity, this passion, this search for passion of solitude. I mean, it's never about fishing, right? It's a hunt for pleasure, for escape, for peace of mind, and for union in nature, all stitched together with a clear filament, a line. And I recently posted an image on Instagram, a photo Rachel took of me painting from a boat. And by the way, Rachel took most of the photos in this show. She and our son Emmett were fishing nearby. And it was interesting to follow the responses. A single question seemed to dominate. Did I use an anchor? No anchor. Then, wouldn't the boat just drift? Yes. Drifting is the entire point. Just ask Tom Thompson, who's been adrift with me since I stumbled on that pucker bush. Thompson, the Canadian national artist and folk hero, painted many of his generous, muscular, direct, and forthright responses to the natural world from a canoe, drifting in the wilds of Ontario's Algonquin Park. Thompson's paint was fluid, full, casual, loose, and descriptive. And it's widely believed that he was well on his way to presaging abstract expressionism when he died tragically in 1917. Right? His painting has always been a touchstone for me, and I think you can see why. So I assume the students here, anyhow, and many of you, have painted outdoors at some point. You sit or you stand. Either way, you're tethered to it. The landscape, the very landscape you're painting, you just are. It can't be any other way. When I'm working outdoors on dry land, my mind and I drift. And Cezanne recognized that we never alight our gaze on the same tree or cloud twice. How could I not drift? The space overhead and behind is just as informative and necessary as that in front. In the boat, this overallness is compounded by a physical drifting. Look out at the landscape, then down at the canvas, look up again, peering into a different part of the forest, meeting a different part of the lake. It's just drives you crazy, but it's so much fun. And so I've started painting, but I've kept wandering, you see, and it forces you to reach for a totality of feeling, something both general and specific to the conditions of the place and day, an overallness that's satisfying. And even if the painting doesn't work out, it's a great excuse to be outdoors. And when you spend a lot of time outdoors, hiking or painting or drifting in a boat, you gotta have picnics. And sometimes we pack a fabulous local vor something, but what's better really than a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, allergies notwithstanding? There's nothing more satisfying in its simplicity. A PB&J even looks like its own little painting. And like the painting, I love the way the feel of it looks. It's sticky, it adheres, it's matte and shiny and coarse and smooth. And like the paint, that sticky, oily binder, the glue for sticking the world to the canvas, peanut butter and jelly sticks to a fresh sourdough bread. So, all right, I know you might be hungry, but just indulge me a little bit longer with this metaphor, okay? I use a straightforward fat over lean method, all right? It's nothing fancy, nothing complicated. The unadulterated peanut butter, of course, is the thick oil color squeezed straight from the tube and mixed and adjusted as needed. The layers representing jam or jelly are concocted of stand oil and other viscous drying oils. And here's the recipe. 5 parts stand oil to 1 part cold-pressed linseed oil. Mixed up and let stand overnight, and that's all you need to start. The mix can become more advanced and adventurous as needed, covers a full dietary range with mixes resembling yogurt, molasses, honey, and maple syrup. And then the material's been transformed. It's been transformed into something else altogether, something unnameable but yummy, sticking to the ribs and binding, this painter at least, to the world. And how cool is it that the same material that resembles a peanut butter sandwich can also look and feel like rock, water, air, or even human skin? Or look like the way pine needles in the sun smell? Or look like the way a river sounds? So I live in Vermont, and I paint the outdoors. And I think a lot about winter. Even when it's not winter, I think about winter. And each Sunday in winter, I cut a hole in the ice. In Finnish, it's called an avanto. An opening in the ice intended for the bracing plunge following the extreme heat of the Finnish sauna. The transition challenges our bodies and reminds us of nature's extremes and our power to endure them, however momentarily. And seriously, I can only stand it for about the length of time this picture's been up on the screen. Just a few seconds. One afternoon, after pulling myself out of the shockingly frigid water, like I'd done countless times over years, I stood there peering into this dark void in the bright ice, and I was transfixed. I saw real beauty, and I noticed it for the first time. Something new, noticed something new, and I noticed it differently. Everything I had been looking for in painting turned out to be right there, in the hole I'd carved into winter itself. These ice cuts are a project within my larger project of painting. It's just one isolated shape, and yet it holds kind of like a clown car of content, but not a funny one, where the clowns keep coming out. An improbably wide range of interests: Finnish culture, the environment, the paint, light and the absence of light, color, and the history of ice harvesting, and my family's own involvement in the ice trade during the Great Depression. And maybe most surprisingly to me, it was a direct line of conversation that emerged with favorite and important modernist and minimalist paintings, like Malevich and Ellsworth Kelly and Agnes Martin. Did you know Agnes Martin grew up on a farm in Saskatchewan? And it's likely that her family harvested ice from a pond on that farm. And not that a painting like this needs any explanation, but to me that's the only explanation for a shape like that on a gray field, a gray icy field like that. Winter, like beauty, is something that's inarguably real and yet has no fixed terms. I paint the winter because it captivates me. I paint the winter because ice is important to me and because it's inevitable. A hole cut in the ice directs attention to the ice, and the prism is very personal. And I like to share my winter paintings and my ice paintings, and I hope that other people will think about ice in a larger way from them. And like much of my work, the ice cuts begin with a drawing, just not with a pencil, with a 6-foot ice saw. One draws with the saw. The saw draws through the ice, and if you'll bear with me, the word saw, of course, is the past tense of the verb to see. And when you're out in the cold and you're on the ice, everything takes on greater meaning. Sawing is a physical action, cutting through a veneer, that skin, a surface, to reveal an in-between space by violently excising a piece of nature. And meaning is found in what's removed rather than what's added. And it's become a kind of signature, like a self-portrait. And because of my fascination with ice in all its forms, I looked especially closely at this Marsden Hartley painting at the Met Brewer Colby College exhibition a couple of years ago, and I hope you all had a chance to see that. Hartley painted an ice harvesting scene, and that caught my attention. Then I noticed Hartley had cleverly embedded his monogram in the landscape. It's an early, bold, personal claim Hartley's making on the landscape, 20 years before he publicly asserts his desire to be the painter of Maine. And not long before he made this painting, he changed his name, dropped his given name, Edmund, and adopted his stepmother's maiden name, Marsden. And like he recognized his new self as part of the landscape, he scripted a lowercase m across the mountains and added a declarative H in the ice in the center of the lake. The winter landscape became one of his first self-portraits. My ice cuts are also declarative. The hole in the ice, after all, is a kind of yawp, a Whitman-like yawp that says, I'm here and this matters to me. And when you've been outside a long time, the things you've noticed stick with you, registering with the quality of a memory or a dream, or as beginnings, ideas emerging from a momentarily comprehended experience, transitory, not secure, hard to find like the source of a river. Then, after you've been looking for some time, something resembling the feeling reveals itself. Erich Fromm said, one cannot be deeply responsive to the natural world without also being saddened by it. And as someone who spends a lot of time looking at the world in a certain way, I sort of agree. But the thing about the synapse, what's shocking in that space is that everything's there. The gamut of feeling and infinite possibility. And when you're looking and responding, you see there's sadness, for sure. But there's also elation, confusion and clarity, loss and hope, transformation, joy, terror, boredom and bitterness, delight and ambivalence, the human and the inhuman. The shock of space, that sort of synaptic sensation, as I've come to understand it, is bridged by the physicality of paint. I'm after something new in a close reading of the familiar, an image bound with the sinuous strength of oil paint, the woods, the field, the river, the falls, the mountain, that shock of space, and me, like peanut butter and jelly slathered between two slices of bread. Thank you.